March 8, 1943. Philippine Islands. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Brennan was dragged from a burning compound with a bullet in her shoulder and classified navigation charts sealed against her chest. The Japanese intelligence officer opened the case, studied the charts and smiled. He had just captured the most valuable prisoner of the war, a cartographer whose precise calculations would guide their next major naval operation. What he didn't know was that buried inside those perfect charts was an error so small it represented just 0.067% of the total measurements. A tiny mistake in tidal calculations that Sarah would discover 6 weeks later in her prison cell, and when she realized what that error meant, when she understood that the Japanese were about to use her flawed charts to plan a major fleet movement through the Surigao Strait, she faced a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She could try to warn them, or she could stay silent and let 4,000 enemy sailors sail into a death trap. What would you do? March 8, 1943. The Philippine Islands. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Brennan pressed her pencil against the navigation chart one more time, triple-checking the coordinates that would guide the supply convoy through the Mindanao Sea. The air in the makeshift command post was thick with humidity, and the smell of mildew that clung to everything in the tropical heat. She'd been working on these charts for 16 hours straight, her eyes burning from the strain of measuring angles and calculating distances under the flickering kerosene lamp. The numbers had to be perfect because 3 transport ships carrying medical supplies, ammunition and reinforcements for the embattled American forces on Corregidor were depending on her calculations. Sarah had graduated top of her class from the Naval Hydrographic Office training program, one of only 12 women selected for the elite cartography unit, and she took that responsibility seriously. Every measurement, every calculation, every stroke of her pen could mean the difference between sailors making it home or disappearing beneath the waves. She heard the distant rumble of artillery fire from the north, where Japanese forces were pushing closer to their position every day. The fall of Manila 2 months earlier had sent shockwaves through the American command structure in the Pacific, and now everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the enemy overran their positions completely. Her commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, had already burned half the sensitive documents in the camp, keeping only the most critical navigation charts and intelligence reports. Sarah rolled her shoulders, feeling the knots of tension that had built up from hunching over the table, and reached for her cold coffee. The liquid was bitter and gritty with sediment, but it was all they had left after the supply lines had been cut 3 weeks ago. She was about to make another notation when the first explosion shattered the night. The kerosene lamp jumped on the table, casting wild shadows across the walls as the building shook from the impact. Sarah grabbed the charts instinctively, holding them flat against the table to prevent them from sliding off. Another explosion, closer this time, and she heard shouting from outside, the sharp crack of rifle fire mixing with the deeper boom of mortar. Captain Reynolds burst through the door, his face streaked with dirt and blood from a cut above his eye. "They've broken through the perimeter," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "We're evacuating. Destroy everything classified." Sarah's hands moved automatically, reaching for the matches they kept ready for exactly this scenario. But Reynolds caught her wrist. "Not those charts," he said, pointing to the navigation maps she'd been working on. "Intelligence says the Japanese are planning a major naval operation in the next 2 weeks. Those calculations might be the only thing that can help our boys figure out where they're going." He pressed a waterproof case into her hands. "Get these to General MacArthur's headquarters in Australia, no matter what happens." Sarah looked at him, understanding the weight of what he was asking. The charts contained months of painstaking work, measurements of currents and tides, depth soundings of every harbor and channel in the southern Philippines. In the wrong hands, they would give the Japanese a complete map of American defensive positions and naval routes. Reynolds must have seen the question in her eyes because he nodded grimly. "I know. If they catch you with those, it'll be bad. But if we don't get that intelligence out, it'll be worse for everyone else." Sarah sealed the charts in the waterproof case and strapped it across her chest under her uniform jacket. The weight of it felt like carrying a bomb. She could hear the fighting getting closer, the Japanese voices shouting commands as they swept through the compound. Reynolds pointed toward the back door. "There's a boat waiting at the south dock. Lieutenant Chen will take you down the coast. Stay in the mangroves. Move only at night." He gripped her shoulder. "Good luck, Commander." Sarah slipped out the back door into the tropical night. The compound was burning now, orange flames licking up the sides of the barracks, casting everything in a hellish glow. She moved quickly, staying low, following the path toward the water. She could see the small fishing boat Reynolds had mentioned, its engine already running, Lieutenant Chen waving urgently from the stern. She was 50 feet from the dock when the spotlight hit her. The beam was blinding, and she heard the harsh shout in Japanese, the unmistakable sound of rifle bolts being worked. Sarah ran. She made it 20 feet before something slammed into her back with the force of a sledgehammer, spinning her around and driving her to the ground. The waterproof case dug into her ribs as she fell, and she had just enough presence of mind to roll onto her stomach, covering it with her body. Boots surrounded her, hands grabbed her arms, yanking her to her feet. Pain radiated from her shoulder where the bullet had caught her, and she felt the warm spread of blood soaking through her uniform. A Japanese officer stepped into the light, his face expressionless as he looked her up and down. He said something she didn't understand, and one of the soldiers ripped open her jacket. The waterproof case fell to the ground between them. The officer picked it up, turning it over in his hands, and Sarah's heart sank. He opened the case, pulling out the navigation charts, and a slow smile spread across his face. He looked at Sarah with something like respect in his eyes. "You are navigator," he said in heavily accented English. "Very important prison." They bound her hands and marched her away from the burning compound, away from Lieutenant Chen and the boat that could have taken her to safety, away from any hope of completing her mission. As they pushed her into the back of a truck with a dozen other captured American soldiers, Sarah looked at the charts in the officer's hands and knew that everything she'd worked for, everything she'd calculated and measured and perfected, was now in enemy hands. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, as they drove her toward the prison camp, was that those charts contained a mistake, a tiny, almost imperceptible error in the tidal calculations for the Surigao Strait, an error so small it represented just 0.0, an error that would change the course of the war in ways no one could predict. The truck bounced along the jungle road, and Sarah pressed her hand against her wounded shoulder, feeling the blood pulse between her fingers, wondering if she would live long enough to see what her mistake would cost. Sarah Brennan died on April 3, 1998, in her sleep at the age of 96 in the small Arlington apartment where she'd lived for the past 20 years. Her body was discovered by her neighbor, a retired Marine colonel named Thomas Hendricks, who checked on her daily and noticed she hadn't picked up her morning newspaper. The funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, and despite Sarah's lifelong desire for privacy, over 300 people attended, including Navy admirals, intelligence officers, Filipino veterans who'd flown in from Manila, and dozens of former students and mentees who credited Sarah with changing their lives. The Navy chaplain who conducted the service spoke about Sarah's courage under fire, her intelligence work that had helped win the Pacific War, her decades of service teaching and mentoring the next generation of naval officers, but he also spoke honestly about her struggles with trauma and guilt, her long battle to find meaning in survival, and her ultimate decision to transform her pain into purpose by helping others. Several people gave eulogies, including Jennifer, the Gulf War veteran Sarah had mentored, who spoke about how Sarah had taught her that carrying the weight of difficult decisions wasn't a burden to be ashamed of, but rather a responsibility to be honored. "Commander Brennan showed me that the opposite of trauma isn't the absence of pain," Jennifer said, her voice breaking. "It's the presence of purpose. She taught me that you don't heal from war by forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't affect you. You heal by acknowledging the cost, honoring the sacrifice, and dedicating your life to making sure it meant something." Alejandra Reyes, now 91 years old and frail, but determined to make the trip from Manila, spoke about the night Sarah had run into the ammunition depot, how she'd risked her life to complete a mission that had saved countless others. "I have known many brave people," Reyes, soldiers who charged into enemy fire, fighters who endured torture without breaking, leaders who made impossible decisions under terrible pressure, but I never knew anyone braver than Sarah Brennan, because her courage wasn't just physical, it was moral. She had the courage to live with what she'd done, to carry that weight for 50 years, and to use it to become a better person, rather than letting it destroy her. After the funeral, a reception was held at the Naval Heritage Center, and that's when the full scope of Sarah's influence became clear. Person after person came forward with stories about how Sarah had impacted their lives. The young cartographer she'd spent hours mentoring until the woman felt confident enough to apply for officer training, the veteran struggling with PTSD, whom Sarah had visited weekly for 2 years until he found his footing again, the congressional aide who'd been inspired by Sarah's testimony about intelligence reform to pursue a career in government service, one elderly man, a Japanese-American translator who'd worked on intercepting Japanese communications during the war, approached Jennifer with tears in his eyes. "I need to tell someone this," he said. "I was part of the team at Station Hypo that received Commander Brennan's transmission from the prison camp. I was the one who first noticed the pattern in the code, the deliberate error in the tidal calculation. When we figured out what she was telling us, when we realized there was a prisoner who'd found a way to warn us about compromised charts, I remember thinking that whoever sent that message was either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless." He paused, wiping his eye. "I spent 50 years wondering who it was, and now that I know, now that I've learned about everything she went through and everything she accomplished afterward, I realize she was both brave enough to take the risk and reckless enough to survive the consequences. The world needs more people like Sarah Brennan." The Navy, in recognition of Sarah's lifetime of service and her role in the Battle of Surigao Strait, established the Commander Sarah Brennan Award for Excellence in Naval Intelligence, given annually to an officer who demonstrates exceptional analytical skill, combined with moral courage in difficult circumstances. The first recipient was a young lieutenant commander who'd blown the whistle on faulty intelligence being used to justify a military operation, risking her career to ensure accurate information was presented to decision-makers. In her acceptance speech, the lieutenant commander said she'd been inspired by Sarah's example, by the understanding that intelligence work wasn't just about gathering information, but about having the courage to acknowledge when that information was flawed or being misused. The Naval Academy added Sarah's story to its ethics curriculum, using her experience to teach midshipmen about the moral complexities of warfare, the long-term psychological cost of combat decisions, and the responsibility that comes with having access to critical intelligence. Students study the Battle of Surigao Strait, not just as a tactical victory, but as a case study in how small errors can have enormous consequences, and how individual courage can change the course of history. But perhaps the most unexpected part of Sarah's legacy emerged in 2015, when a Japanese historian named Takashi Yamamoto published a book examining the Battle of Surigao Strait from the Japanese perspective. Yamamoto had interviewed survivors from the Japanese fleet, analyzed declassified documents from both sides, and concluded that while the American victory had been devastating, it had also been necessary. The battle shortened the war, Yamamoto wrote. It demonstrated to the Japanese high command that continued resistance was futile, that American forces had intelligence and positioning capabilities that made traditional naval warfare impossible. In a strange way, the sailors who died at Surigao Strait may have saved hundreds of thousands of Japanese lives by helping end the war sooner. Yamamoto went on to specifically address Sarah's role in the battle. Commander Brennan's actions were those of a soldier doing her duty in wartime. While the loss of Japanese lives was tragic, holding her personally responsible for those deaths would be like holding a bomber pilot responsible for every person killed in an air raid. War creates situations where people must make terrible choices, and the moral burden falls not on individuals trying to survive and serve their countries, but on the leaders who start wars in the first place. The book was controversial in both Japan and the United States, with some Japanese readers accusing Yamamoto of being too sympathetic to the American perspective, and some American readers uncomfortable with his frank acknowledgement of the human cost of the victory. But many veterans from both sides found his analysis helpful, a way to think about their wartime experiences that acknowledged the complexity and tragedy, without assigning simple judgments of right and wrong. Sarah's apartment was cleared out by her executor, and among her possessions was a locked metal box that contained her wartime medals, commendations and personal papers. Inside that box was a journal Sarah had kept sporadically throughout her life, dozens of entries spanning from 1943 to just a few months before her death. The journal was donated to the National Archives with instructions that it be made available to researchers studying the Pacific War and the long-term effects of combat trauma. The entries provide a raw, unfiltered look at Sarah's internal struggle with guilt, purpose and meaning. Some passages are heartbreaking in their honesty about the pain she carried, I can still see their faces sometimes, she wrote in 1957. The Japanese sailors who died because of my error. I know I'll never know who they actually were, what they looked like, whether they had families, but my mind creates faces for them anyway. Young men who probably didn't want to be at war any more than I did, who were just following orders and trusting their charts, never knowing those charts would lead them to their deaths. How do I live with that? How does anyone live with that? But other entries show Sarah's gradual evolution toward acceptance and purpose. I've been thinking about what Elena told me in the Philippines, she wrote in 1965, about the question not being whether what I did was right or wrong, but what I do now with the life I have. Maybe that's the only answer that makes sense. Maybe the way I honor the dead is by living fully, by helping others, by making sure my survival counts for something. It won't bring them back, won't undo what happened, but it might give their deaths meaning beyond just being casualties of war. The final entry in the journal was dated December 1997, just 4 months before Sarah's death. I'm 95 years old now, and I've spent more years living with the consequences of that than I spent in the Navy before it happened. I've taught hundreds of students, mentored dozens of officers, helped countless veterans find their way through trauma similar to mine. I've tried to live a life worthy of the survival I was given, and I think I've succeeded more often than I've failed. If there's an afterlife, if I somehow meet those Japanese sailors whose deaths I caused, I hope I can look them in the eye and tell them honestly that I didn't waste the life their deaths purchased. That has to be enough, because it's all I have. Today, Sarah Brennan's name appears on memorials in 3 countries, the United States, the Philippines, and surprisingly, Japan, where a peace memorial in Hiroshima includes her among the list of people on both sides who work to end the war and prevent future conflict. Her textbook on nautical cartography is in its 9th edition, still considered the definitive work in the field. The scholarship program she founded has helped over 200 women pursue careers in navigation and intelligence. Her advocacy work led to significant improvements in how the military treats combat trauma and moral injury, and her story continues to inspire people who face impossible choices, who carry heavy burdens, who wonder if one person can make a difference. The 0.067% error that changed the course of the Pacific War remains one of the most studied incidents in military history, analyzed by tacticians, ethicists, and psychologists trying to understand how small mistakes can have enormous consequences, and how individuals can transform tragedy into purpose. But Sarah herself would probably say the most important lesson isn't about the error, or the battle, or even the victory. It's about what comes after, about how you live with the weight of your decisions, how you find meaning in survival, and how you use whatever time you're given to help others carry their own burdens. In the end, that's the real legacy of Commander Sarah Brennan, not the charts she drew or the battles she influenced or the awards she received, but the hundreds of lives she touched by having the courage to acknowledge her wounds and the wisdom to transform them into strength. The tiny error that led to the biggest ambush in American history was just the beginning of her story, and the decades she spent afterward proving that survival can have purpose, that guilt can coexist with service, and that even the heaviest weights can be carried if you understand why you're carrying them. That was the real victory, the one that mattered. The prison camp at Naval was worse than anything Sarah had imagined. The truck had driven for 3 days through the jungle, stopping only when the guards needed to relieve themselves, or when the road became impassable and they had to wait for other vehicles to clear the way. Sarah's shoulder wound had festered in the heat, and by the time they arrived at the camp, she was delirious with fever, barely conscious as they dragged her from the truck and threw her into one of the bamboo huts that served as barracks for the prisoners. She woke up 2 days later to find a Navy nurse named Margaret kneeling beside her, cleaning the infected wound with water that had been boiled in a tin can. "Easy now," Margaret said softly. "You're one of the lucky ones. Bullet went clean through, no bone damage." Sarah tried to sit up, but the pain in her shoulder flared and she fell back onto the dirt floor. "The charts," she mumbled. "Did they take the charts?" Margaret gave her a puzzled look. "I don't know anything about charts, honey. I just know they brought you in half dead 3 days ago." The camp held about 200 prisoners, mostly American and Filipino soldiers captured during the fall of Bataan and Corregidor, but there were also a handful of nurses, 2 female radio operators, and now Sarah. The Japanese commandant, Colonel Takeshi, ran the camp with brutal efficiency. The daily routine was simple and crushing: wake at dawn, work in the rice paddies, or the rubber plantation, until the sun was directly overhead, return to camp for a bowl of watery rice, and whatever vegetables the guards felt like providing, then back to work until sunset. Anyone who couldn't keep up was beaten, anyone who tried to escape was shot. Sarah learned this on her 4th day in the camp when a young private from Kansas made a break for the fence during the midday meal. The guards didn't even bother to chase him. They simply shot him in the back as he ran, and left his body hanging on the barbed wire as a warning to the others. That night, lying in the sweltering darkness of the barracks with mosquitoes whining around her head, Sarah thought about the navigation chart. She'd seen Colonel Takeshi examining them the day after her arrival, spreading them out on a table in his office, while a civilian in a dark suit pointed to various markings and made notes in a leather-bound journal. The civilian was clearly an intelligence officer, and from the way he studied the charts, Sarah knew they were being analyzed and probably copied. The question was what they would do with the information. Would they use her calculations to plan their own naval movement? Would they share the data with their submarine commanders to help them hunt American ships? The possibilities gnawed at her. 6 weeks passed. Sarah's shoulder healed, leaving an angry red scar that pulled tight when she raised her arm. She fell into the rhythm of the camp, learning to move slowly to conserve energy, to eat every scrap of food no matter how rotten it tasted, to keep her head down and avoid attracting the attention of the guards. But her mind never stopped work. Every night she would lie awake, mentally reviewing the charts she'd created, trying to remember every measurement, every notation, and that's when she found it. It was 3 in the morning, and Sarah was staring at the bamboo ceiling of the barracks, running through the tidal calculations for the Surigao Strait for the 100th time, when she realized something was wrong. She'd used the wrong baseline for the lunar cycle. It was a tiny error, the kind of thing that happens when you're working 16-hour days under stress, when you transpose 2 numbers or forget to carry a decimal point. But the implications were staggering. If the Japanese used her charts to plan a naval operation through the Surigao Strait, they would be calculating their movements based on tides that were incorrect by approximately 2 feet. 2 feet didn't sound like much, but in the shallow waters of the strait, where there were dozens of submerged reefs and sandbars, 2 feet could be the difference between safe passage and running aground. More importantly, if American forces somehow got word that the Japanese were using those charts, they could predict exactly where the enemy ships would have to navigate to avoid the obstacles they thought existed. It would be like having a map to an ambush point. Sarah sat up in the darkness, her heart pounding. She had to get this information out. She had to find a way to let someone know about the error, so they could use it against the Japanese. But how? The camp was isolated, deep in the jungle, with no communication to the outside world. The guards watched everything, searched every prisoner regularly. Even if she could get a message written, there was no way to smuggle it out, unless there was. Sarah thought about the civilian in the dark suit, the intelligence officer, who'd been studying her chart. He'd visited the camp 3 times since her arrival, always spending hours in Colonel Takeshi's office, always leaving with a briefcase full of documents. If the Japanese were planning to use her navigation data, they would need to verify it, to send reconnaissance flights or submarine patrols to check the accuracy of her measurements, and that meant communication with the outside Japanese command structure. There had to be a radio in the camp. The next morning, during the march to the rice paddies, Sarah started paying attention to things she'd previously ignored. She watched the guards, noting which ones were permanent camp staff and which ones came and went. She observed the routine of the officers, tracking when Colonel Takeshi met with his subordinates, and when he was alone in his office. She listened to the sounds of the camp, trying to identify the location of any equipment that might require electricity. It took her 2 weeks, but she finally confirmed it. There was a radio room in a small building next to the commandant's office, operated by a Japanese signals corporal who looked barely old enough to share. She could see the antenna wire running up through the trees whenever they marched past on their way to work. The question now was how to get to it, and what message she could possibly send that wouldn't get her shot immediately. Sarah knew she was running out of time because she'd overheard the guards talking about a major operation planned for October. If her charts were going to be used, it would be soon, and if she was going to do something to counter it, she had to act now. The opportunity came on September 15, 1943. One of the guards, a corporal named Yoshi, who sometimes showed small kindnesses to the prisoners, bringing extra water on the hottest days or looking the other way when someone needed to rest, was celebrating his birthday. The other guards had smuggled in sake, and by 10 o'clock that night, Sarah could hear them singing in their quarters, their voices carrying across the compound. She'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, watching, learning, memorizing every detail of the camp's security routine. She knew that the radio operator, the young corporal she'd been observing, always left his post at midnight to make his rounds, checking the perimeter fence before returning to monitor the equipment. She knew that Colonel Takeshi retired to his quarters at 11 o'clock sharp every night, unless there was an emergency. She knew that the path from the women's barracks to the radio room required crossing 40 feet of open ground that was illuminated by a single spotlight, but that spotlight had a blind spot created by the shadow of the officers' quarters. What she didn't know was whether she had the courage to actually do this. Sarah waited in the darkness of the barracks until she heard the midnight bell, the clanging of the metal triangle that marked the changing of the guard shift. Then she slipped out of her bunk, moving carefully to avoid waking the other prisoners, and made her way to the door. The guard posted outside the women's barracks was slumped against the wall, and from his deep rhythmic breathing, Sarah guessed he'd gotten into the sake as well. She stepped over him, staying in the shadows, and began moving toward the radio room. Her heart was hammering so hard she was sure someone would hear it, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, to move deliberately, to not panic. She made it to the blind spot in the spotlight, and pressed herself against the wall of the officers' quarters, listening. Nothing. No alarms, no shouts, no sound of boots running toward her. She edged along the wall until she reached the corner of the building, then peered around toward the radio room. The young signals corporal was just leaving, exactly on schedule, heading toward the fence line with a flashlight in one hand. Sarah counted to 20, giving him time to move away, then ran across the final 10 feet to the radio room door. It was locked, but the lock was old and simple, and Sarah had watched enough of the guards fumbling with keys to know how to manipulate it. She pulled a thin piece of wire from her pocket, a piece she'd been shaping and bending for weeks, and inserted it into the lock. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the wire, but she forced herself to stay calm, to feel for the pins inside the mechanism. Click. The lock turned, and she was inside. The radio room was small and cramped, dominated by a large communication set that hummed with electrical current. Sarah had trained on similar equipment during her time at the Naval Hydrographic Office, and she quickly oriented herself, identifying the frequency dial, the Morse key, the power switch. She knew she had maybe 5 minutes before the signals corporal completed his rounds and returned. 5 minutes to compose and transmit a message that could change the outcome of the war. She sat down at the radio, her fingers hovering over the Morse key, trying to figure out what to say, and how to say. She couldn't just broadcast in English, because the Japanese monitored all frequencies, and would immediately know there was an unauthorized transmission. She needed to send something that would sound like routine Japanese military traffic, but would actually contain the information she needed to get out. Then she remembered something from her intelligence briefings. Before the war, the Japanese Navy used a code system for transmitting navigational data, a series of number groups that represented coordinates and tidal information. If she could mimic that format, but intentionally include the error from her original charts, any American cryptanalysis team reviewing intercepted Japanese transmissions would notice the discrepancy and potentially realize it was deliberate. Sarah's fingers flew over the Morse key, tapping out a message in the Japanese naval code format she'd memorized. She included the coordinates for Surigao Strait, the tidal data with the deliberate 0.067% error, highlighted by being transmitted twice, and a timestamp that matched the October operation date she'd overheard the guards discuss. She was halfway through the transmission when she heard footsteps outside. Sarah's blood ran cold. The signals corporal was returning early, probably cutting his rounds short because of the drinking that was going on. She could see his shadow through the window, moving toward the door. She had maybe 10 seconds before he discovered her. Sarah made a split-second decision. Instead of trying to finish the message, or attempting to run, she grabbed a pencil from the desk and wrote a quick series of numbers on her palm, the coordinates and error data in case she didn't make it. Then she reached up and yanked the radio's antenna connection loose, creating a burst of static that would sound like equipment failure, rather than an unauthorized transmission. The door opened just as she dove under the deck. The signals corporal entered, muttering to himself in Japanese, and Sarah held her breath as his boots walked past, just inches from her hiding spot. He was moving toward the radio, probably to check why the equipment had gone silent. This was it. She was going to be discovered, and there was nothing she could do to prevent it. But then another voice called out from outside, one of the drunk guards shouting for the corporal to come help with something. The young man hesitated, looked at the radio with its loose connection, then apparently decided it could wait until after he dealt with whatever crisis was happening outside. He turned and left, and Sarah heard his footsteps fading away. She waited another 30 seconds, then crawled out from under the desk, reconnected the antenna, and finished her transmission in one long burst, praying that someone somewhere was listening. When she was done, she wiped down everything she'd touched, slipped back out the door, and made her way back to the barracks the same way she'd come, moving through shadows, avoiding the spotlight, stepping over the still sleeping guard. She collapsed onto her bunk, her whole body shaking with adrenaline, and looked down at the numbers written on her palm. Whether or not her message had gotten through, whether or not anyone would understand it, whether or not it would make any difference at all, she had done everything she could, and now all she could do was wait and hope that somewhere out there, someone was paying attention. Station Hypo, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, September 16, 1943. Though, 3-4. Errors. Lieutenant Joseph Rochafer sat at his desk in the basement of the Naval Administration building, surrounded by stacks of intercepted Japanese radio transmissions, his eyes burning from 20 hours of continuous work, trying to crack the latest modifications to the Japanese naval code. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of stale coffee, and somewhere in the back corner, one of the IBM tabulating machines was clattering away, processing the frequency analysis of message traffic from the past week. Rochafer had been running the Navy's cryptanalysis unit at Pearl Harbor since before the attack that had brought America into the war, and in that time he'd developed an almost supernatural ability to recognize patterns in the Japanese communications. He could look at a string of code groups and immediately sense if something was off, if the message was genuine traffic or a deception attempt, if the sender was following standard protocol or improvising under stress. That's why the transmission that came across his desk at 3:42 in the morning made him sit up straight in his chair. It was a Japanese naval code message, transmitted on a frequency typically used for navigational updates, formatted correctly with all the proper authentication groups, but something about it felt wrong. The message contained tidal data for the Surigao Strait, a waterway in the southern Philippines that had shown up increasingly in Japanese communications over the past 2 months. That part made sense because intelligence indicated the Japanese were planning some kind of major naval operation in that region, but the numbers themselves were off. Rochafer grabbed his slide rule and started working through the calculations, comparing the tidal data in the intercepted message against the charts his own team had prepared based on historical records and astronomical data. The Japanese figures were wrong, not wildly wrong, not the kind of error that would indicate a corrupted transmission or a poorly trained radio operator, but consistently wrong by a very specific amount, approximately 0.067% across all the measurements. That was too precise to be accidental. Someone had deliberately introduced an error into the Japanese naval charts, and then someone else had transmitted that error in a format that would look like routine Japanese military traffic, but would actually alert American intelligence to the discrepancy. Rochafer called over his chief analyst, Commander Edward Layton. "Take a look at this," he said, pointing to the numbers he'd written out. "Tell me what you see." Layton studied the figures, his brow furrowing as he worked through the implications. "That's not a natural error," he said slowly. "If these numbers were wrong because of bad measurements or faulty equipment, the errors would be random, distributed across a bell curve, but these are systematic. Every single measurement is off by almost exactly the same percentage." He looked at Rochafer. "Someone's sending us a message." They spent the next 6 hours dissecting the transmission, analyzing every aspect of it, trying to figure out who had sent it and why. The timestamp on the message indicated it had been transmitted from somewhere in the Davao region of the Philippines, an area under Japanese control with multiple prisoner-of-war camps. The format of the code suggested the sender had intimate knowledge of Japanese naval communication protocols, but wasn't following them perfectly, making small deliberate mistakes that would be invisible to a casual Japanese radio operator, but obvious to trained American cryptanalysts. By mid-morning they had their theory. An American prisoner with knowledge of navigation and cartography had somehow gained access to a Japanese radio and sent out a coded warning about enemy naval charts that contained deliberate errors. The question was what to do with this information. Rorschach called a meeting with Admiral Nimitz's intelligence staff, laying out everything they'd discovered. The implications were staggering. If the Japanese were planning to use these flawed charts for a major naval operation through the Surigao Strait, and if American forces knew exactly how the charts were wrong, they could predict with precision where the Japanese ships would have to navigate to avoid the obstacles they believed existed. They could set up an ambush at the exact points where the enemy would be most vulnerable. But there was a risk. If they acted on this information and the Japanese realized their charts had been compromised, they would know there was a security breach, possibly from one of their prison camps. Any American prisoners with navigational knowledge would immediately become suspects, and the consequences would be severe. Commander Layton brought up another concern. What if this is a Japanese deception? What if they deliberately sent us bad charts through a fake prisoner transmission to draw our forces into a trap? It was a valid question, and for 3 days the intelligence team at Station Hypo worked around the clock to verify the authenticity of the transmission and cross-reference it with other intelligence they'd gathered about Japanese naval movement. They compared the tidal data against reports from submarine patrols in the area, checked the transmission characteristics against known Japanese radio equipment, and analyzed the timing of the message against the schedule of guard shifts at the various POW camps in the Davao region. Everything pointed to the transmission being genuine, sent by an American prisoner, who had risked everything to get this information out. Finally, on September 20th, Admiral Nimitz made the decision. They would act on the intelligence but do it carefully, building up forces in the region gradually, so as not to alert the Japanese to the fact that their naval charts had been compromised. They would position submarines along the expected approach route, prepare destroyer squadrons for rapid deployment, and most importantly they would use the 0.067% error to calculate exactly where the Japanese fleet would need to pass through the Surigao Strait if they were trying to avoid obstacles that didn't actually exist. The preparation took weeks. Ships were quietly repositioned, ammunition stocks were built up at forward bases, reconnaissance flights were increased over the southern Philippines to track Japanese naval movement, and all the while, the intelligence team at Station Hypo continued monitoring Japanese radio traffic, looking for any sign that they'd discovered the compromised charts, or identified the source of the leak. On October 12, 1943, Japanese radio traffic suddenly exploded with activity. Multiple fleet units were receiving movement orders, submarines were being directed to take up patrol positions, and supply ships were making emergency runs to forward bases. Something big was about to happen, and from the communication patterns it was clear the operation would involve the Surigao Strait. Rorschach and his team worked through the night tracking every message, plotting every ship movement, and as the picture became clear, they realized the scale of what was coming. The Japanese were committing a major portion of their southern fleet to this operation, including several battleships, multiple cruisers, and at least 15 destroyers. It was the largest concentration of Japanese naval power in the region since the Battle of Midway, and thanks to one prisoner's desperate transmission and a tiny zero-pointer, American forces would be waiting for them at exactly the right place at exactly the right time. The only question that haunted Rorschach as he watched the preparations unfold was whether the person who had sent that transmission, whoever they were, would survive long enough to know that their sacrifice had made a difference. Sarah knew something had changed when Colonel Takeshi started conducting random inspections of the radio room. It happened the morning after her unauthorized transmission, and at first she thought it was just coincidence, but when the inspections continued day after day, always at different times, always thorough, she realized that someone had noticed something was wrong. The young signals corporal looked increasingly nervous, and twice Sarah saw him being questioned by the intelligence officer in the dark suit, the civilian who'd been studying her navigation charts. They were looking for evidence of a security breach, and it was only a matter of time before they found it or decided to take more direct action. Sarah started having nightmares about being dragged from her bunk in the middle of the night, about being taken to Colonel Techi's office for interrogation, about what the Japanese would do to extract a confession. She'd heard stories from other prisoners about the torture techniques used by the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, and knew that if they seriously suspected her of espionage, she wouldn't be able to hold out for long. She thought about the numbers she'd transmitted, the coordinates and tidal data that she hoped had reached American intelligence, and wondered if it would be enough. October came, and with it a tension in the camp that Sarah could feel like electricity in the air. The guards were jumpy, snapping at prisoners for minor infractions, and the number of Japanese military vehicles passing through the area increased dramatically. Convoys of trucks loaded with supplies, staff cars carrying officers, even tanks on flatbed transporters heading south toward the coast. Something big was happening, and the Japanese were mobilizing for it. On October 15th, Sarah woke to the sound of aircraft engines overhead, dozens of them, the distinctive drone of bombers heading south in formation. She stumbled out of the barracks with the other prisoners, shading her eyes against the morning sun, watching the planes pass overhead like a river of metal. "That's got to be 200 aircraft," Margaret whispered beside her. "They're going after something major." The guards shouted at them to get back inside, but Sarah had seen enough. Whatever operation the Japanese were launching, it was massive, and if her message had gotten through, if American forces were preparing to meet them, the next few days would determine whether her desperate gamble had been worth the risk. That afternoon, Colonel Tekishi summoned Sarah to his office. Her stomach dropped when the guard came to get her, but she forced herself to stay calm, to show no fear as she was marched across the compound. The other prisoners watched her go with expressions of dread, knowing that being called to the commandant's office rarely ended well. Teki was sitting behind his desk when she entered, the intelligence officer in the dark suit standing beside him. Between them, spread across the desk, were Sarah's original navigation charts, the ones they'd captured with her 6 months ago. "Lieutenant Commander Brennan," Teki said, his English precise despite his heavy accent, "we have questions about your chart." Sarah's heart was pounding, but she kept her face neutral. "I'll answer what I can, sir." The intelligence officer stepped forward, pointing to a section of the chart showing the Surigao Strait. "These measurements," he said, "you calculated the tidal variations for this area. How certain are you of their accuracy?" Sarah looked at the charts, at her own careful notations, and realized they were testing her. They wanted to know if she'd deliberately sabotaged the data, or if any errors were genuine mistakes. If she admitted to intentional sabotage, she was dead. If she claimed the charts were completely accurate, they might believe her, or they might use her as verification for an operation that would send Japanese sailors to their deaths. Either way, she was trapped. "I calculated those measurements under combat conditions," Sarah said carefully. "With limited reference materials and time pressure, I believe they're accurate within standard navigational tolerances, but I can't guarantee perfection." The intelligence officer studied her for a long moment, then looked at Colonel Tekishi and shook his head slightly. They'd decided she wasn't lying, or at least that she wasn't lying on purpose. Sarah felt a wave of relief so intense it made her dizzy. She'd passed their test, but she also knew what it meant. The Japanese were about to use her flawed charts for their operation, and there was nothing she could do to stop it or to warn them. Tekishi dismissed her, and Sarah walked back to the barracks, feeling like she'd just signed the death warrants of hundreds of Japanese sailors. She told herself they were the enemy, that they would kill Americans without hesitation, that this was war and people died in war. But that night, lying in the darkness, she couldn't stop thinking about all those young men on ships heading into battle with navigation charts that would lead them into an ambush. 2 days later, on October 17th, the artillery fire started. It was distant at first, a rumble from the south like thunder, but it went on continuously, hour after hour, the sound of a massive naval engagement. The prisoners listened in awed silence, trying to guess what was happening from the rhythm of the explosion, the heavy booming of battleship guns, the sharper cracks of destroyer fire, the occasional massive blast that could only be a magazine explosion or a torpedo strike. The battle lasted for 6 hours, and when it finally fell silent, the smoke from it was visible even from the prison camp, a dark smudge on the southern horizon. The guards were feuded, speaking in hushed tones, and when Sarah caught glimpses of their faces, she saw shock and grief. Something terrible had happened to the Japanese fleet. It was 3 days before they learned the details, whispered between prisoners who'd overheard the guards talking, pieced together from fragments of conversation, and the expressions of the Japanese officers who came and went from the camp. The Battle of Surigao Strait had been a catastrophic defeat for Japan. An entire battle fleet, 7 warships including 2 battleships, had been ambushed in the narrow waters of the strait and systematically destroyed by American naval forces that had been waiting in perfect position. The Japanese had lost over 4,000 sailors, and the Americans had sunk or severely damaged every single ship in the Japanese formation. It was, by any measure, one of the most decisive naval victories in history, and it had happened because the Japanese had sailed directly into a trap, guided by navigation charts that were wrong by exactly. But Sarah heard this news and felt her knees go weak. She stumbled back to her bunk and sat down hard, trying to process what she'd done. 4,000 Japanese sailors who'd gone to sea, trusting their charts, trusting their navigators, never knowing they were sailing toward annihilation because of a tiny error in tidal calculations, made by an exhausted American cartographer working under a kerosene lamp 6 months ago. Margaret sat down beside her, putting a hand on her shoulder. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah opened her mouth to tell her everything, to confess what she'd done, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain that she'd deliberately let those men die? How could she make anyone understand that this was the price of war, that those 4,000 enemy sailors might have saved 40,000 American lives if the Japanese fleet had gotten through? She couldn't. So instead, she just nodded and said she was fine, and tried not to think about the weight of all those deaths settling onto her shoulders like a physical burden she'd carry for the rest of her life. The weeks after the Battle of Surigao Strait were the darkest of Sarah's life. The Japanese guards became brutal, taking out their rage and grief on the prisoners, beating anyone who looked at them wrong, cutting rations even further, until people were literally starving. 3 prisoners died in November, their bodies too weak to fight off disease. The camp commandant seemed to age overnight, his face becoming gaunt and hollow, and the intelligence officer in the dark suit stopped visiting altogether. Sarah learned through the prisoner grapevine that he'd committed suicide after the battle, unable to live with the shame of the defeat. The guilt ate at her constantly. During the day, when she was working in the rice paddies or hauling water from the well, she could sometimes push it away, focus on the immediate task of survival, but at night it always came back. She would lie awake calculating how many sailors had died because of her error, wondering if any of them had families, children, wives waiting for news that would never come. Margaret noticed Sarah's deterioration and tried to help, forcing her to eat when she refused food, sitting with her during the worst moments when the guilt threatened to overwhelm her completely. "Whatever you're carrying," Margaret said one night, "you need to let it go. We're all doing terrible things to survive this war. The only thing that matters is making it through to the end." But Sarah couldn't let it go because she knew something Margaret didn't know. The error hadn't been an accident. She'd discovered it, recognized it, and instead of trying to warn the Japanese, she'd used it as a weapon. She'd turned her mistake into a deliberate deception, and 4,000 men had paid the price. December brought rumors that American forces were advancing through the Pacific, island hopping toward the Philippines. The prisoners heard whispers of battles at places called Tarawa and Kwajalein, of Japanese losses mounting, of the tide of the war finally turning. Some of the men started talking about liberation, about American troops arriving to free the camps, but Sarah knew better. The more desperate the Japanese situation became, the more dangerous things would be for the prisoners. By January 1944, the camp population had dropped to just over 100 survivors. Disease, starvation, and execution had taken the rest. Sarah had lost 40 pounds, her uniform hanging off her skeletal frame, but she was still alive, still working, still carrying the weight of what she'd done. Then on February 3rd, everything changed. A truck arrived at the camp carrying a Japanese admiral and his staff. The prisoners were assembled in the central courtyard, forced to stand at attention despite their weakness. The admiral was an old man with white hair and a face like carved stone. He spoke in Japanese, his voice carrying across the silent compound, and one of the guards translated. "You are to be moved," the guard said. "The Imperial Army is relocating this camp to a more secure location inland. You will march beginning tomorrow at dawn. Anyone who cannot keep up will be left behind. The other prisoners exchanged frightened glances. They all knew what left behind meant. But Sarah barely heard the announcement because she was staring at something the Admiral's aide was carrying, a leather briefcase with official-looking documents visible through the partially open flap, documents that looked like navigation charts. After the assembly, as the prisoners were herded back to their barracks, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't undo what she'd done, couldn't bring back the 4,000 dead sailors, but she could try to prevent it from happening again. If the Japanese were planning another naval operation using her flawed charts, she had to find a way to warn them, or to sabotage the operation before more people died. That night, Sarah waited until the camp was quiet, then slipped out of the barracks one more time. She moved through the shadows toward the commandant's office where the Admiral and his staff were staying, knowing this was probably suicide, knowing the guards would shoot her on sight if they caught her, but unable to live with herself if she didn't at least try. She made it to the window of the office and peered inside. The Admiral was asleep in a chair, his briefcase on the floor beside him. Through the open flap, Sarah could see charts, reports, what looked like operational orders. She could also see 2 guards stationed at the door, alert and armed. There was no way she could get inside without being discovered. Sarah was about to retreat when she heard voices approaching. She pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath as Colonel Takeshi and another officer walked past, deep in conversation. The Admiral is convinced we can use the American woman's charts to plan a safe passage through the Mindanao Straits, Takeshi was saying. He believes the previous operation failed because of poor execution, not because of bad intelligence. The other officer laughed bitterly. He's a fool. Those charts cost us 7 ships and 4,000 men. Using them again would be madness. Nevertheless, those are his orders. The convoy departs in 3 weeks and will be using the charts to navigate through waters we believe the Americans don't know we can access. They walked on, their voices fading, and Sarah felt her stomach clench. They were going to use her charts again, despite the disaster at Surigao Strait, despite the evidence that the navigational data was flawed. The Admiral was so committed to the belief that Japanese execution had been the problem rather than the intelligence itself, that he was willing to risk another fleet on the same compromised information. Sarah made it back to the barracks without being discovered, and lay on her bunk trying to figure out what to do. She couldn't access the radio again because the signals corporal had been replaced with a more vigilant operator after the battle. She couldn't sabotage the charts directly, because they were kept under guard. The only option she could think of was to somehow disrupt the convoy departure itself, but that would require resources and help she didn't have. The next morning, as they began the forced march inland, Sarah realized the opportunity she'd been given. The march would take them through territory that was increasingly contested between Japanese and American forces. Intelligence reports had indicated American guerrilla groups were operating in the area, Filipino resistance fighters who'd been harassing Japanese supply lines and communication posts. If Sarah could somehow make contact with them, she could get a message out about the planned Japanese convoy and the flawed charts they'd be using. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. The march was brutal. The prisoners walked for 12 hours a day with minimal food and water, and by the 3rd day, people started collapsing. True to his word, the guards left them where they fell, sometimes shooting them, sometimes just leaving them to die by the roads. Sarah forced herself to keep moving, to stay strong, to watch for any opportunity. On the 5th day, that opportunity came in the form of an ambush. They were moving through dense jungle when gunfire erupted from the trees, Filipino guerrillas attacking the convoy. The guards scattered, returning fire, and in the confusion, several prisoners managed to run into the jungle. Sarah was one of them. She crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at her clothes and face, hearing shouts behind her but not daring to look back. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, then collapsed behind a fallen log, gasping for breath. When she finally looked up, she saw a Filipino man crouched nearby, a rifle in his hands, watching her with cautious eyes. "American?" he asked in accented English. Sarah nodded, too exhausted to speak. The man smiled. "Good, we take you to Captain. You tell us about Japanese camp, Japanese movements." Sarah managed to get to her feet. "I'll tell you everything," she said, "but first I need to get a message to American command. It's about a Japanese naval operation, and if we don't stop it, a lot of people are going to die." The guerrilla camp was hidden deep in the jungle, a collection of crude shelters built under the cover of massive trees, camouflaged so well that Sarah wouldn't have seen it if she wasn't being led directly to it. The Filipino fighters who'd rescued her from the march were part of a larger resistance movement that had been fighting the Japanese occupation since 1942, conducting raids, gathering intelligence, and helping Allied prisoners escape when possible. Their leader was a former Philippine Army colonel named Alejandro Reyes, a stocky man in his 50s with grey hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that assessed Sarah carefully as she was brought before him. "You are the navigator," Reyes said in perfect English. "The Japanese have been looking for you very carefully since the battle. They suspect you sent the information that led to their defeat at Surigao." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "How do you know that?" Reyes smiled slightly. "We intercept Japanese communication. We heard them discussing a security breach from one of their prison camps, a female American officer with navigational expertise. It was not difficult to connect the pieces." He gestured for her to sit. "Tell me about this urgent message you need to send." Sarah spent the next hour explaining everything: her capture, the charts, the error she'd discovered, her unauthorized radio transmission, and most importantly, the conversation she'd overheard about the planned convoy through the Mindanao Straits. Reyes listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as she described the Admiral's determination to use her flawed charts, despite the disaster they'd already caused. When she finished, Reyes was quiet for a long moment, then called over his communications officer, a young man named Carlos who operated a portable radio hidden in a false bottom crate. "Can you reach our American contact?" Reyes asked. Carlos nodded. "The submarine makes contact every 3 days. Next window is tomorrow night at 2300 hours. Reyes turned back to Sarah. "You will compose your message tonight. Make it precise, make it clear, and include everything American intelligence will need to verify your identity and the accuracy of your information. If what you say is true, we have less than 3 weeks to prevent another disaster." Sarah worked through the night, writing and rewriting the message, trying to compress everything she needed to say into a format that could be transmitted quickly via Morse code. She included her service number, capture date, a description of the charts she'd created and the specific 0.067% error in the tidal calculations, and detailed information about the planned Japanese convoy including the approximate departure date, the intended route through the Mindanao Strait, and the fact that they would be using her compromised navigational data. The next night at exactly 11 o'clock, Carlos powered up the radio and began transmitting. Sarah stood beside him watching his fingers work the Morse key, sending out her message in rapid bursts, to minimize the chance of Japanese direction-finding equipment locating their position. The transmission took less than 3 minutes, and then Carlos was shutting down the equipment, disconnecting the antenna, preparing to move the camp in case the Japanese had tracked their signal. "Now we wait," Reyes. "If your message was received, we should get confirmation within 48 hours. Those 48 hours were the longest of Sarah's life. She stayed in the guerrilla camp, helping with whatever tasks needed doing, trying not to think about what would happen if her message hadn't gotten through or if American command decided not to act on it. The guerrillas treated her kindly, sharing their meager rations, giving her clean clothes to replace her filthy prison uniform, but she couldn't relax, couldn't stop running through scenarios in her mind. On the third night, Carlos received a response. It was brief, just a few code groups confirming that the message had been received and understood, along with a request for additional details about Japanese force composition and timing. Sarah spent another hour composing a follow-up message with everything she could remember about the Admiral's plans, the number of ships involved, and the specific charts they'd be using. American intelligence now had everything they needed to plan a response, but Reyes had a different idea. "If the Americans simply ambush this convoy like they did at Surigao," he said, studying a map of the region, "the Japanese will know their charts are compromised. They'll realize someone is feeding intelligence to the Americans, and every prisoner in every camp will be in danger. They'll execute anyone with navigational knowledge just to be safe." Sarah felt cold dread settling in her stomach because she knew he was right. Her desperate attempt to save lives might end up getting hundreds of prisoners killed. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. Reyes pointed to a location on the map. "There's an ammunition depot here, supplying the Japanese naval base, where this convoy will depart. If that depot were to explode, say from a guerrilla attack, it would delay the convoy departure by at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. That would give American forces time to reposition without making it obvious they have advanced knowledge of Japanese plans. He looked at Sarah, and it would appear to be just another guerrilla operation, not related to any intelligence breach. Sarah understood immediately. Instead of exposing the compromised charts by springing another perfect ambush, they would disrupt the operation in a way that looked like random resistance activity. The Japanese would still suspect something was wrong, but they wouldn't know exactly what, and more importantly, they wouldn't connect it to any specific prisoner or intelligence leak. "Can your people hit that depot?" Sarah asked. Reyes smiled grimly. "We've been planning to hit it for months. We just never had enough advance warning to know when it would be fully stocked. Thanks to you, we now know exactly when to strike for maximum effect." The operation was planned for 3 days later. Reyes selected his best fighters, 20 men and women who'd been conducting guerrilla operations for years, and Sarah insisted on going with them. "You're not a soldier," Reyes argued. "You're valuable intelligence, and we need to get you back to American lines." But Sarah was adamant. "Those charts, that error, it's killed 4,000 people already. I need to see this through. I need to do something to stop it from killing more." Reyes studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "You can come, but you follow orders. You don't take risks, and if shooting starts, you get down and stay down." "Understood," Sarah agreed, and 2 days later, she found herself crouched in the jungle darkness with 20 Filipino guerrillas, watching the Japanese ammunition depot through the trees. The facility was smaller than she'd expected, just a few warehouses surrounded by a chain-link fence with guard towers at each corner. But Reyes had explained that the Japanese kept their ammunition supplies dispersed after a series of successful Allied air raids, making each individual depot less valuable but also less defended. The attack plan was simple and brutal: explosives at 2 points on the fence, a diversionary assault on the front gate to draw the guards, then a small team would slip inside and plant charges in the main warehouse where naval artillery shells were stored. If everything went according to plan, the explosion would destroy not just the depot but also damage the dock facilities adjacent to it, delaying the convoy departure indefinitely. At midnight, the operation began. Sarah watched from her position as 2 guerrillas crept up to the fence and placed their charges, then retreated to safe positions. The explosives detonated simultaneously, blowing holes in the fence and triggering alarms throughout the depot. Japanese soldiers poured out of their barracks, running toward the breaches, exactly as planned. That's when the main assault team, led by Reyes himself, hit the front gate with concentrated fire, creating chaos and confusion. In the noise and darkness, 3 guerrillas slipped through one of the fence breaches and made their way toward the main warehouse. Sarah could see them moving between buildings, staying in shadows, making their way to their target. They were almost there when one of the Japanese guards spotted them and opened fire. The guerrillas went down, and Sarah watched in horror as Japanese soldiers swarmed the area, clearly preparing to sweep the entire facility for other infiltrators. The mission was failing, and if those charges weren't planted, the convoy would depart on schedule and sail right into American guns, using charts that would give away the intelligence compromise. Sarah made a split-second decision. Before anyone could stop her, she was running toward the fence, toward the breach, toward the warehouse. She heard Reyes shouting behind her, heard bullets snap past her head, but she didn't stop. She reached the fallen guerrillas, grabbed the satchel of explosives from one of them, and kept running. She made it inside the warehouse, found herself surrounded by stacks of artillery shells, and began placing charges with hands that shook so badly she could barely work the timer. 30 seconds. That's all the time she allowed herself before the Japanese would find her. She set the last charge, started the timers, and ran for the exit. She almost made it. The explosion caught her 10 feet from the warehouse door, a wall of heat and pressure that picked her up and threw her like a rag doll. She hit the ground hard, felt something break inside her, and then there was only darkness and pain and the sound of secondary explosions, as the entire ammunition depot went up in a series of massive blasts that lit up the night sky like a second sun. Sarah woke up in a missionary hospital on the island of Negros, 3 days after the ammunition depot raid. Her left leg was in a cast, 3 ribs were broken, and she had burns on her arms and back from the explosion, but she was alive. The Filipino doctor who treated her explained that Reyes and his fighters had pulled her from the wreckage of the depot and carried her through 40 miles of jungle to reach this hospital, losing 2 men to Japanese patrols along the way. You are very lucky, the doctor said, or very blessed, perhaps both. The missionary hospital was operating in secret, hidden in a remote mountain valley where the Japanese rarely ventured, treating wounded guerrillas and helping Allied prisoners who'd escaped from the camps. Sarah spent 2 weeks there recovering, listening to radio reports that confirmed the ammunition depot explosion had delayed the Japanese convoy departure by at least 3 weeks, exactly as planned. But she also heard darker news. In retaliation for the guerrilla attack, the Japanese had executed 20 prisoners from various camps across the Philippines, randomly selected to send a message about the consequences of resistance. Sarah listened to those reports and added 20 more deaths to the weight she carried. Reyes visited her when she was strong enough to sit up. American submarine is coming, he said. 3 days from now, they'll take you back to Australia, back to your command. He hesitated. The message you sent, the intelligence about the convoy, American forces acted on it. They positioned submarines along the route, but because of the delay from the depot explosion, the Japanese cancelled the entire operation. They're investigating the security around those charts you created, probably assuming the Americans somehow learned about their plans through espionage. He looked at her seriously. You did it. You stopped them from using the flawed charts, and you did it without exposing the intelligence breach. As far as the Japanese know, it was just bad luck and guerrilla activity. Sarah should have felt relieved, but instead, she just felt exhausted. 20 prisoners died because of that raid, she said quietly. Reyes sat down beside her bed. 20 prisoners died because the Japanese are cruel and brutal, not because of what you did. If that convoy had sailed using those charts, if there'd been another ambush like Surigao Strait, the Japanese would have executed hundreds of prisoners in their rage. You saved lives. You need to accept that. The submarine pickup happened right on schedule. Sarah was carried down to the coast in a makeshift stretcher, then transferred to a small boat that took her out past the Japanese patrol zone to where USS Tautog waited on the surface in the darkness. The submarine crew treated her like a hero, giving her the captain's cabin, making sure she had everything she needed for the journey to Australia. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she'd gotten away with something terrible, that she'd caused thousands of deaths through a mistake she'd then weaponized, and that the fact it had worked out didn't make it right. She arrived at Allied headquarters in Brisbane on March 15, 1944, and was immediately debriefed by Navy intelligence. They wanted to know everything, about the charts, about the error, about her time in the prison camp, about the radio transmission and the ammunition depot. Sarah told them everything, holding nothing back, even though part of her expected to be court-martialed for going rogue and conducting unauthorized operations. Instead, Admiral Nimitz himself called her into his office and personally thanked her for her service. What you did took remarkable courage, he said. That transmission you sent from the prison camp gave us the intelligence we needed to prepare for Surigao Strait. The victory there changed the balance of power in the Pacific theater. It saved American lives and shortened the war. Sarah wanted to tell him about the 4,000 Japanese sailors who died, about the 20 executed prisoners, about the weight of all that death, but looking at the admiral's face, she realized he already knew. He understood the terrible mathematics of war, the way victory always came at a cost, the burden that fell on people who made the hard decisions. You're being promoted to commander, Nimitz continued, and assigned to the Naval Hydrographic Office in Washington. Your work on Pacific navigation will be classified at the highest level, and you'll never be able to talk about what happened, but know that your country is grateful. Sarah accepted the promotion, returned to the United States, and spent the rest of the war working on navigation charts in a windowless office in Washington, D.C., never making another error, triple-checking every calculation, haunted by the knowledge of what a tiny mistake could cost. The war ended in August 1945, and Sarah was there in the office when news came through about the Japanese surrender. People were celebrating, crying, hugging each other, but Sarah just sat at her desk, thinking about all the sailors who died in the Surigao Strait, wondering if any of them had families who still didn't know how their sons and husbands and fathers had really died. She served in the Navy for another 15 years, becoming one of the first female commanders to lead a navigation unit, training a new generation of cartographers and navigators, always stressing the importance of precision, of checking your work, of understanding that the numbers on a chart represented real lives depending on you to get it right. She never married, never had children, kept mostly to herself except for the annual reunions with other Pacific War veterans where she would sit quietly in the corner, listening to their stories but never sharing her own. In 1975, 30 years after the war ended, the Navy declassified some of the intelligence reports from the Battle of Surigao Strait, and a military historian discovered the connection between Sarah's flawed charts and the Japanese defeat. He contacted her, asking for an interview, wanting to write a book about how one small error had changed the course of the Pacific War. Sarah refused. She was 73 years old, living in a small apartment in Arlington, Virginia, and she had no interest in being remembered as the woman who'd accidentally won a battle. The historian was persistent though, and eventually Sarah agreed to meet with him once, just to set the record straight. They sat in her living room, surrounded by books and memories, and Sarah told him the whole story, the charts, the error, the capture, the prison camp, the radio transmission, everything. When she finished, the historian sat back in his chair, his expression awe. You realized the error wasn't an accident, he said slowly. You discovered it in the prison camp, and instead of trying to warn the Japanese, you used it as a weapon. That's not luck or coincidence. That's intelligence warfare at the highest level. Sarah shook her head. It was desperation and guilt, and a tiny chance to do something that might make a difference. I got 4,000 men killed because I was careless with a calculation. I don't want to be celebrated for that. The historian looked at her for a long moment. With respect, Commander, you're wrong about one thing. Those 4,000 sailors died because Japan started a war of aggression and conquest. They died because their leaders sent them into battle with flawed intelligence. You didn't kill them, the war killed them. What you did was survive and find a way to use your knowledge to save American lives. That's not something to be ashamed of. Sarah didn't respond because she'd been having this argument with herself for 30 years, and still hadn't reached a conclusion she could live with. The historian left, and as far as Sarah knew, he never wrote his book. She died in 1998 at the age of 96, her Navy commendations and medals packed away in a box she never opened. Her role in the Battle of Surigao Strait, known to only a handful of intelligence officers, and classified documents that almost no one would ever read. But in 2015, 70 years after the war ended, a researcher digging through newly declassified files at the National Archives discovered Sarah's full story and published it online. Within days, it had been shared thousands of times, with people marveling at the 0.0067% error that had changed history, at the courage of a woman who'd risked everything to get intelligence out of a prison camp, at the moral complexity of using an error as a weapon. The Navy, responding to public interest, posthumously awarded Sarah the Navy Cross, the service's second highest decoration for valor, and her name was added to the Naval Intelligence Hall of Honor. Her story became part of the curriculum at the Naval Academy, taught as an example of quick thinking under pressure, and the importance of understanding that information itself can be a weapon as powerful as any gun or bomb. And in the Philippines, where the guerrillas she'd fought alongside had long since passed into history, there's a small memorial in the mountains of Negros, marking the spot where the ammunition depot once stood, with a plaque that reads, "In memory of Commander Sarah Brennan, U.S. and the Filipino guerrillas who gave their lives so others might live." The smallest error can change the world. Whether she would have wanted to be remembered that way, whether she ever made peace with what she'd done, no one will ever know. But her legacy lives on in every navigation chart, every careful calculation, every officer who understands that precision and courage sometimes matter more than firepower, and that the decisions we make in desperate moments can echo through history in ways we never imagined possible. The years after the war were difficult for Sarah Brennan in ways she never could have anticipated. The physical wounds healed relatively quickly, the broken ribs knitting back together, the burns on her arms fading to pale scars that she could hide under long sleeves. But the psychological damage ran deeper and proved far more resistant to treatment. She had nightmares almost every night, dreams where she was back in the prison camp being interrogated, or watching ships explode in the darkness of Surigao Strait, or running through the jungle with the ammunition depot exploding behind her. She would wake up gasping, covered in sweat, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. The Navy had doctors who dealt with what they called combat fatigue, and Sarah spent hours in their offices, talking about her experiences, trying to process the trauma and guilt that haunted her. Some of the doctors were helpful, encouraging her to write about what she'd been through, to talk to other veterans who'd faced similar moral dilemmas, to understand that war forced people into impossible situations where every choice led to someone dying. Others were less helpful, suggesting she should just focus on the positive, on the lives she'd saved rather than dwelling on the ones she'd taken, as if it were possible to simply decide not to feel guilt anymore. Sarah threw herself into her work at the Naval Hydrographic Office, spending 12 and 14-hour days perfecting navigation charts, training new cartographers, developing better methods for calculating tidal variations and ocean currents. Her colleagues knew she'd served in the Pacific, that she'd been a prisoner of war and escaped, but the classified nature of her intelligence work meant she couldn't discuss the specifics with anyone who didn't have proper clearance. This isolation made everything harder, because Sarah couldn't share the burden with people who might understand. She became known as a brilliant but difficult officer, someone who demanded perfection from her subordinates and had no patience for careless work. Junior officers learned quickly that if Commander Brennan found an error in your calculations, you would be called into her office and subjected to a lecture about the importance of precision that felt less like professional development and more like attending your own funeral. What they didn't know was that every error Sarah caught, every mistake she corrected, felt like another life saved, another disaster prevented, a small way to atone for the 0.067% that had killed so many. In 1952, 7 years after the war ended, Sarah received a letter from Alejandro Reyes, the Filipino guerrilla leader who'd helped her escape and conduct the ammunition depot raid. He'd survived the war, become a successful businessman in Manila, and was reaching out former comrades to organize a reunion. He wanted Sarah to come to the Philippines, to meet with the surviving guerrillas, to see how the country had recovered and rebuilt. Sarah's first instinct was to refuse because the thought of returning to the Philippines, of walking through the same jungle where she'd suffered and seen others suffer, felt unbearable. But Reyes was persistent, sending her several more letters over the following months, and eventually Sarah agreed to go, thinking that maybe confronting the place where everything had happened might help her finally find some peace. She flew to Manila in June 1953, and Reyes met her at the airport with a broad smile and a warm embrace. He'd aged well, his hair completely white now, but his eyes still sharp and alert. "You look good, Commander," he said, "strong, like you've been fighting different battles." They drove into the mountains to the valley where the guerrilla camp had been, where Sarah had sent her desperate radio messages and planned the raid that had nearly killed her. The camp was gone now, the jungle reclaiming the cleared spaces, but Reyes had arranged for several of the surviving fighters to meet there, about 15 men and women who'd fought alongside Sarah during those desperate last months of the war. They gathered in a clearing, cooking food over an open fire, sharing stories and memories, and Sarah found herself opening up in ways she hadn't since the war ended. She told them about the nightmares, about the guilt, about the weight of knowing that her error had killed thousands of people even if it had ultimately helped win the war. The guerrillas listened quietly, and when she finished, an old woman named Elena, who'd been one of the fighters at the ammunition depot, spoke up. "You carry too much alone," Elena said. "We all did things in the war that haunt us. I killed a Japanese soldier when I was 16 years old, shot him in the back while he was eating his dinner, and I still see his face sometimes when I close my eyes. But we did these things because we had to, because there was a war and people were suffering and we had to choose between bad options and worse options." She leaned forward. "The question is not whether what you did was right or wrong, because in war, those words lose their meaning. The question is what you do now, with the life you still have. Do you let the guilt destroy you, or do you use it to drive you to do better, to help others, to make sure the sacrifice meant something?" Sarah thought about that conversation for months afterward, and slowly, gradually, she began to shift her perspective. She started volunteering at veterans' hospitals, visiting wounded sailors, talking to them about their experiences, helping them process their trauma in ways the doctors couldn't. She founded a scholarship program for women studying navigation and cartography, personally reviewing applications and mentoring young officers who wanted to follow in her footsteps. She wrote technical papers about navigation that became standard references in the field, and she testified before Congress about the need for better intelligence gathering and analysis to prevent future wars. The nightmares never completely went away, but they became less frequent, less intense. Sarah learned to live with them, to recognize them as the price she paid for surviving when so many others hadn't. She kept in touch with Reyes and the Filipino guerrillas, exchanging letters several times a year, and in 1960 she returned to the Philippines for the dedication of a memorial to the fighters who died during the war. Standing in front of that memorial looking at the names carved into stone, Sarah finally understood something she'd been struggling with for 15 years. She couldn't change what had happened, couldn't bring back the dead or undo her mistakes, but she could honor their memory by living a life of purpose and service. When she retired from the Navy in 1965, after 30 years of service, Sarah didn't retreat into isolation like some veterans did. Instead, she became more active, teaching navigation at the Naval Academy as a civilian instructor, writing a textbook on nautical cartography that's still used today, and speaking at veterans events about the importance of mental health support for service members struggling with combat trauma. She never talked publicly about the specific details of the Battle of Surigao Strait or her role in it, because those files remained classified, but she found ways to share the lessons she'd learned about courage, sacrifice and living with the consequences of your decisions. In her 80s, when most people would have been content to retire completely, Sarah became an advocate for veterans with PTSD, working with mental health organizations to develop better treatment programs and pushing the Veterans Administration to recognize that psychological wounds were just as real and just as deserving of treatment as physical injury. She gave interviews to medical journals, participated in studies about long-term trauma effects, and mentored younger veterans who were struggling with their own guilt and memory. One of these veterans, a young Navy officer named Jennifer who'd served in the Gulf War, asked Sarah how she'd managed to live with herself after making decisions that led to so many deaths. Sarah thought about the question for a long time before answering. "You don't manage it," she finally said. "You carry it. Every single day you wake up and carry that weight, and some days it feels impossible and some days it feels a little lighter, but it never goes away completely. What changes is your understanding of why you're carrying it. At first I thought it was punishment, that I deserved to suffer for what I'd done, but eventually I realized it was responsibility. Those people died because of choices I made, and the only way to honor their deaths was to live a life worthy of the survival I'd been given." She paused, looking at Jennifer seriously. "The weight you carry, the guilt and the memories and the what-ifs, that's not a burden you need to get rid of. That's a reminder of your humanity, of the fact that you understand the cost of war in a way most people never will. Don't try to forget it. Use it, let it drive you to be better, to help others, to make sure the next generation doesn't have to carry the same weight you do." Jennifer later said that conversation changed her life, helped her find a path forward through her own trauma, and she went on to become a psychologist specializing in treating combat veterans. Sarah's influence rippled out through dozens of people like Jennifer, creating a network of officers and advocates who understood that strength wasn't about being invulnerable but about acknowledging your wounds and continuing to serve despite them. By the time Sarah reached her 90s, she'd become something of a legend in Navy circles, not for any single heroic action but for the cumulative weight of decades spent serving, teaching and helping others navigate the psychological aftermath of war. The Navy kept trying to get her to participate in documentaries or historical projects about the Pacific War, and she kept refusing, maintaining that her story was still classified and not appropriate for public discussion. But in 1995, 50 years after the end of World War II, the Navy declassified large portions of the intelligence files related to the Battle of Surigao Strait, and Sarah's role in the victory could no longer be kept secret. The phone calls started almost immediately, reporters wanting interviews, historians requesting meetings, veterans groups inviting her to speak at commemorative events. Sarah handled the attention with the same careful precision she'd brought to her navigation work, agreeing to a few select interviews with military publications but declining most media requests. When she did talk about her experiences, she focused not on the dramatic moments but on the moral complexity, the impossible choices, the long-term psychological cost of warfare. "Everyone wants to hear about the heroism," she told one interviewer from the Naval Institute proceeding. "They want the story of the brave prisoner, who outsmarted her captors and won a battle with nothing but her wits and determination, but that's not the real story. The real story is about living with the consequences of your decisions for 50 years, about waking up every morning knowing that your survival came at the cost of thousands of other people's deaths, about trying to find meaning in that sacrifice and purpose in your continued existence." The interviewer asked if she regretted what she'd done, if she wished she could go back and make different choices. Sarah was quiet for a long moment before responding, "Regret is too simple a word for what I feel. If I hadn't sent that transmission, if I hadn't let the Japanese use those flawed charts, American sailors would have died instead. maybe more of them, maybe in even more terrible ways, the war wouldn't have ended any sooner, and the suffering would have continued. So no, I don't regret making the choice I made in that moment, but I do carry the weight of it, and I think that's appropriate. The moment we stop feeling the cost of our wartime decisions is the moment we become monsters. That interview was reprinted in dozens of military journals and academic publications, and Sarah's nuanced perspective on the morality of warfare became influential in how the military taught ethics to new officers. Her statement that the weight is appropriate became something of a rallying cry for veterans struggling with moral injury, a validation that their guilt and trauma weren't weaknesses to be overcome, but rather evidence of their humanity to be acknowledged and honored.